The husband of a British member of parliament who was murdered last year by a man with extreme right-wing views is hitting back at President Trump for sharing anti-Muslim hate videos sponsored by that group. Brendan Cox tweeted, "You have a mass shooting every single day in your country. Your murder rate is many times that of the UK. Your healthcare system is a disgrace. You can't pass anything through that Congress that you control. I would focus on that." Joining me now from London is Brendan Cox, and joining me here in the studio, Richard Stengel, the former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, also an MSNBC political analyst, and still with us, Gillian Tett, U.S. Managing Editor for the Financial Times. Brendan, first of all, obviously huge sympathy to you with the way you are carrying on. But tell me, what is it about President Trump's retweeting of that discredited anti-Muslim hate video that so angered you? Tell our audience.
I think we're used to this president saying inflammatory things, tweeting things that aren't necessarily true, making things up. But I think this was a new bar. This was him actively promoting a neo-fascist group in the UK whose leaders have been convicted on the grounds of racially aggravated harassment. The woman that he retweeted was personally convicted of harassing a Muslim woman in front of her 4 kids. These are people who exist in order to spread hatred and bile. And the leader of the free world sharing their material, giving them a microphone, matters. It matters not just because I don't like the content, I don't like what he was saying, but it matters because it drives hate. And when you drive hate, there are consequences. My family is a living consequence of what happens when people are fed hatred. And this president, it pains me to say it, but this president has become a purveyor of that hate.
How are your children doing?
My kids are as good as they can be, I think. You know, they have lots of Joe's energy and spirit and love still in them, and they're still excited about life, and they get a hell of a lot from life. They're still very young, they're only 5 and 6, but their life will never be the same. You know, they'll never get their mum back, and that impacts on everything we do, every moment. I've been asked a few times, you know, if this brought it all back, and the reality is, every morning I wake up and Joe's not there, it brings it all back. I don't need the president to remind me of that, but it does add insult to that injury.
Gillian Tett here knew Jo Cox, as so many journalists did, for her vigor, for her energy. Gillian, just briefly, your
No,
thoughts.
well, but I'd like to explain. If you want to understand why so many British parliamentarians are so angry about this, Jo was an extraordinarily popular, lively icon of a young, juggling female politician who really was full of integrity. I salute Brendan for coming on television and talking about this when it's so painful. But the fact is that for the British government and for the British parliamentarians, this type of retweeting is completely beyond the pale.
And Rick Stengel, as a diplomat and a former journalist, an author, and a diplomat, for the president to be doing this, I saw a British official last night in Washington really angry about this.
It's incredibly irresponsible. As Joe's husband said, this is a neo-Nazi group. But what is so annoying about it is ISIL's narrative, the narrative of the Islamic extremists, is that the West is against Muslims, that the West is persecuting Muslims. What the President of the United States is doing is confirming that narrative for those violent extremists. He is actually increasing the problem in the U.S. and in the UK. And what I would add, too, looking at Theresa May's retweet, is we're seeing the unraveling of the special relationship between Britain and the US. This is something the president doesn't understand. It's something that has kept us close together for decades. But to the Brits now, as Joe's husband said, he is the very emblem of the ugly American. And these bonds are coming asunder.
Brendan, when you think of Jo Cox and the humanitarian mission she was on, and how do you see that being carried out now in the political sphere, and with this kind of hate being regendered?
We're going to take forward her legacy, the things that she cared about, whether that was she had a background in aid work around the world, so we're taking forward her work on Syria. She was also very active on loneliness amongst older people in her own constituency. We've got a whole plan in the run-up to Christmas. But at its core, what we're working on now is making sure that hatred of any shape. I don't care where that hatred comes from. I don't care whether that hatred is driven on the basis of a far-right ideology where they hate people because of the colour of their skin, or if it's an Islamist ideology and they hate people on the basis of their religion. That hatred is the same, and as the gentleman just said, what the president is doing is he's not only actively inflaming the far right, but he's playing exactly into the hands of ISIS. Hate in all shapes and forms needs to be resisted. This isn't a partisan issue. This isn't something which should come down to one country or another. It's not something which should be an issue that's debated. We should all be able to agree that hatred, no matter where it comes from, is beyond the pale, and it should be defeated, not retweeted.
And how does it damage American diplomacy in the UK and in Europe?
I think you're already seeing, unfortunately, a fraying of the ties. I mean, I hope, as someone that's like proudly committed and very committed to the UK-US relationship, it's been so fundamental to our two countries, and particularly to the UK since the Second World War. I think that this is now at risk. You know, those relationships have been based on not geography but on values, and those values of decency, of respect for institutions, of the rule of law, of liberal democracy, of individual rights. This president is betraying those values. So I think and I expect that our relationship as countries will endure, but this president is doing everything he possibly can to strain that. And that's, I don't say that with any anger, I say it with a huge amount of regret.
Well, Brandon, thank you very much. Joe Cox is still a light, a shining light for a lot of us on both sides of the Atlantic, and thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate that. And thank you, Rick Stengel. Thank you always, Gillian Tett.